What if everything you thought you knew about protecting royalty was wrong? What if the most dangerous threats didn't come from assassins with guns or bombs, but from tiny flying machines no bigger than your hand? What if the person who discovered this threat wasn't a highly trained agent, but a simple security guard who noticed something strange in the bushes? This is the story that palace officials never wanted you to hear. A story about how modern technology turned royal protection upside down, how one guard's curiosity saved lives, and how a small drone almost changed the course of history. It's a tale of courage, quick thinking, and the kind of bravery that doesn't make headlines but should. The world of royal security is built on secrets, but some secrets are too important to keep hidden. This is one of them. James Mitchell had been walking the same perimeter for 3 years, but something felt different that Tuesday morning in October. The autumn mist clung to the carefully manicured grounds of Balmoral Castle, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere that made even the most familiar pathways seem mysterious. As a security guard for the royal estate, James had learned to trust his instincts above all else, and right now, those instincts were screaming that something was wrong. The 34-year-old former military man had taken this job not for the glamour or prestige, but because he genuinely believed in protecting people. His colleagues often joked that he was too serious, too observant for his own good. They called him Eagle Eye Mitchell behind his back, but James didn't mind. In his world, being too careful could mean the difference between life and death. It was 6:47 a.m. when he first heard it, a subtle buzzing sound that didn't belong to the morning symphony of birds and whined through the Scottish Highlands. James paused mid-step, his trained ear immediately distinguishing this mechanical hum from the natural sounds around him. Years of military service in Afghanistan had taught him to identify threats by sound alone, and this particular noise sent a chill down his spine. The royal family was scheduled to arrive later that morning for their annual autumn retreat. The Queen herself would be walking these very paths in just a few hours, accompanied by several family members and a minimal security detail, the kind of relaxed environment that made security professionals like James extremely nervous. Balmoral was supposed to be their safe haven, their escape from the intense scrutiny and potential threats of public life. Following the sound, James moved with the practiced silence of someone who had spent years navigating hostile territory. The buzzing seemed to be coming from a thick grove of ancient oak trees near the castle's eastern wall, an area that provided perfect cover for anyone wanting to observe the estate undetected. As he approached, the sound grew clearer, more distinct, and definitely artificial. Through a gap in the bushes, James caught his first glimpse of what would later be described as a sophisticated surveillance operation. Hovering about 15 feet off the ground, barely visible through the morning mist, was a small drone equipped with what appeared to be a high-resolution camera and some kind of listening device. The drone was painted in a matte black color that made it nearly invisible against the dark branches and shadows. But this wasn't just any commercial drone that a curious tourist might use to get photos of the castle. This was military-grade equipment, the kind that James had seen used in combat zones for intelligence gathering and target acquisition. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Someone was conducting detailed surveillance of the royal estate, and they had been doing it for who knows how long. James immediately activated his radio, keeping his voice low and controlled despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Control, this is Mitchell on East Perimeter. I have a situation that requires immediate attention. Unknown aircraft conducting surveillance near Sector 7. The response came back within seconds. Mitchell, clarify unknown aircraft. Are you reporting a helicopter or plane in restricted airspace? Negative. Control. This is a small, unmanned aerial vehicle. Appears to be military specification, currently hovering in concealed position with surveillance equipment active. There was a pause on the other end of the radio, and James could practically hear the wheels turning in the control room. Drone threats were still relatively new in 2019, and most security protocols hadn't been updated to deal with this kind of sophisticated aerial surveillance. The Royal Protection Detail was trained to handle human threats, vehicle-based attacks, and conventional aircraft incursions, but small drones represented an entirely new category of potential danger. Maintain visual contact, Mitchell. Do not engage or alert the target. Backup units are en route to your position. James settled into a position where he could observe the drone without being detected, his mind racing through the implications of what he was witnessing. The device was operating with a level of sophistication that suggested this wasn't the work of overzealous journalists or curious civilians. Someone with significant resources and technical expertise was gathering intelligence on the royal family's private residence. As he watched, the drone began a systematic pattern of movement, focusing its camera on specific windows, entrances, and defensive positions around the castle. Whoever was controlling this device knew exactly what they were looking for. They were mapping the estate's security layout, identifying potential entry points, and documenting the daily routines of the guards. The most chilling realization came when James noticed the drone's particular attention to the private garden area where the Queen traditionally took her morning walks. The camera lingered on the pathways, the benches where she often paused to feed the dogs, and the secluded spots where she liked to read correspondence. Someone was creating a detailed profile of the monarch's most private and vulnerable moments. Through his earpiece, James could hear the rapid coordination taking place in the control room. Additional security personnel were being deployed, the estate's anti-aircraft specialists were being consulted, and, most importantly, the royal family's arrival was being delayed pending a full security assessment. Mitchell, we need you to follow that device if it moves. We have electronic countermeasures specialists en route, but we need to understand its full operational pattern before we take any action. The request made perfect sense from a security standpoint, but it also meant that James would be tracking a potentially dangerous surveillance operation through terrain that offered limited cover. If the drone operators detected his presence, there was no telling how they might react. This could escalate from surveillance to a direct confrontation very quickly. As if responding to his thoughts, the drone suddenly changed its behavior. Instead of the methodical surveillance pattern it had been following, it began moving in rapid, erratic directions, as though its operators had become aware of the security response. The device's camera swiveled frantically, scanning the grounds below for signs of the approaching guard units. James realized that his position had likely been compromised. The drone's sophisticated sensors had probably detected the increased radio traffic or spotted the movement of backup personnel. The situation was about to become much more dangerous, and he found himself at the center of what could potentially be a serious threat to the royal family. The drone began ascending rapidly, apparently preparing to retreat from the area. James knew that if this device escaped, the intelligence it had gathered could be used to plan a future attack or infiltration. The detailed surveillance footage would provide any hostile group with exactly the kind of information they needed to breach the estate security. Without waiting for orders, James began running through the underbrush, trying to keep pace with the ascending drone. His military training kicked in, and he found himself automatically calculating angles, distances, and potential intercept points. The device was moving toward the estate's northern boundary, where the terrain became more rugged and provided numerous hiding spots for its operators. As he pursued the drone, James couldn't help but think about how this moment represented a fundamental shift in the nature of royal security. For centuries, protecting the monarchy had meant watching for human threats, screening visitors, and maintaining physical barriers. But technology had changed the rules of the game. Now, threats could literally fly over walls, operate from miles away, and gather intelligence without ever setting foot on royal property. The implications were staggering. If a small drone could conduct detailed surveillance of Balmoral Castle undetected for unknown periods of time, what other royal residences had been compromised? What other sensitive government facilities were vulnerable to this kind of high-tech espionage? The sound of approaching helicopters filled the air as the Royal Protection Service's rapid response team arrived on scene. James could see the confusion and concern in the movements of the additional security personnel as they tried to adapt their traditional tactics to deal with this aerial threat. Everyone was learning as they went, making up procedures on the fly, for a situation that none of their training had adequately prepared them to handle. The drone had now climbed to almost 200 feet, well beyond the range of any handheld countermeasures, but still clearly visible against the cloudy Scottish sky. James continued his pursuit on foot, maintaining radio contact with the control room and providing real-time updates on the device's movement and behavior. What happened next would not only change the protocols for royal security, but would also launch James Mitchell from an anonymous guard into someone whose quick thinking and dedication would be remembered in the classified files of the Royal Protection Service for years to come. The real test of his courage and training was just beginning. The drone's retreat had led James into terrain that was both beautiful and treacherous. The rolling hills and dense forests that surrounded Balmoral Castle had served as natural protection for the royal estate for generations. But now they provided perfect cover for whoever was operating this sophisticated surveillance equipment. As James climbed higher into the Scottish Highlands, following the mechanical buzz that seemed to stay just ahead of him, he began to understand the true scope of what he was dealing with. Through his earpiece, he could hear the frantic coordination taking place in the security control room. The Royal Protection Service was activating protocols that had never been used before, calling in specialists from military intelligence, and bringing online electronic warfare capabilities that most people didn't even know existed. The simple discovery of a drone in the castle grounds had triggered a security response that reached the highest levels of government. "Mitchell, we're tracking the device on our radar systems now," came the voice of his supervisor, Chief Inspector Sarah Williams. "It appears to be heading toward a vehicle parked approximately 2 miles northeast of your current position. We have units moving to intercept, but you're our closest asset to the target." The weight of responsibility settled heavily on James's shoulders. He was no longer just a perimeter guard following suspicious activity. He had become the tip of the spear in what was rapidly developing into a major security operation. Behind him, he could hear the distant sound of vehicles and helicopters as the full resources of the Royal Protection Service mobilized. But for now, he was alone in the wilderness with a potentially dangerous enemy. As he crested a small hill, James got his first clear view of the landscape ahead. The drone was descending rapidly toward a clearing about half a mile away, where he could just make out the shape of a dark-colored van partially concealed under a canopy of trees. Even from this distance, he could see the sophisticated antenna array mounted on the vehicle's roof. This was clearly a professional operation with significant technical backing. The realization that he was potentially walking into a confrontation with organized criminals or foreign agents made James's pulse quicken, but his military training kept him focused and moving forward. He had been in far more dangerous situations during his service in Afghanistan, and he knew that the key to survival was maintaining tactical awareness while continuing to gather intelligence. Using his binoculars, James began documenting everything he could see about the operation below. The van appeared to be a modified Mercedes Sprinter with tinted windows and what looked like additional armor plating around the driver's compartment. There were at least 2 individuals visible near the vehicle, both dressed in dark clothing and moving with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested military or intelligence backgrounds. "Control, I have visual on the target location," James reported quietly into his radio. "Vehicle is a dark blue Mercedes van, modified for surveillance operations. I count 2 hostiles. Appears to be professional setup with significant electronic equipment. Understood, Mitchell. Do not engage. Maintain observation and wait for backup. Estimated time to your location is 15 minutes. But 15 minutes felt like an eternity when James watched one of the figures near the van suddenly point in his direction and begin speaking urgently into a handheld radio. The sophisticated surveillance equipment that had detected the royal estate's security response had apparently also spotted his approach. The element of surprise was gone, and the situation was about to become much more dangerous. The 2 men near the van began moving with sudden urgency, packing equipment and preparing for what appeared to be a rapid departure. The drone, meanwhile, had completed its landing and was being quickly disassembled by one of the operators. James realized that he was witnessing the conclusion of what had likely been an extensive intelligence-gathering operation, and if these people escaped, all the valuable information they had collected about royal security would disappear with them. Without waiting for backup, James began moving down the hillside toward the van, using the natural cover of rocks and trees to mask his approach. His military experience had taught him that sometimes the best defense was a bold offense, and right now, surprise and aggression might be his only advantages against what appeared to be a well-equipped and professional adversary. As he got closer, James could hear fragments of conversation from the two men. They were speaking in what sounded like Eastern European accents, discussing something about package delivery and client satisfaction. The implications were chilling. This wasn't just casual espionage or journalism, but what appeared to be a commercial intelligence operation, potentially selling royal security information to the highest bidder. The sound of approaching helicopters had grown louder, and James could see the two men becoming increasingly agitated as they realized that their escape window was rapidly closing. One of them, a tall man with close-cropped hair and military bearing, began shouting orders at his companion while frantically loading equipment into the back of the van. James had positioned himself about 50 yards from the vehicle, close enough to see details, but still far enough away to avoid immediate detection. Through his binoculars, he could make out sophisticated computer equipment, multiple drone charging stations, and what appeared to be high-end surveillance gear worth hundreds of thousands of pounds. This was clearly a well-funded operation with significant resources behind it. The shorter of the two men suddenly froze and pointed directly at James's position. Despite his careful approach and use of cover, he had been spotted by someone with clearly professional training in counter-surveillance techniques. The game of cat and mouse was over, and James found himself exposed on a hillside with two potentially dangerous individuals who now knew exactly where he was. "Control, my position is compromised," James reported urgently into his radio. "Targets are aware of my presence and appear to be preparing defensive measures. Request immediate backup and medical support." The response was immediate and reassuring. "Backup is 3 minutes out. Mitchell, Royal Navy helicopter with armed response team, is approaching your location. Maintain cover and do not engage unless directly threatened." But the two men near the van had apparently decided that retreat was no longer an option. The taller one had produced what appeared to be a military-grade rifle, while his companion was setting up some kind of electronic device that began emitting a high-pitched whining sound. James realized that they were deploying some form of electronic countermeasures, probably designed to disable the approaching helicopter's navigation systems. The situation had escalated from surveillance to active resistance, and James found himself at the center of what was rapidly becoming a military-style engagement. His years of experience in combat zones had prepared him for moments like this, but the knowledge that he was protecting the royal family added an extra layer of intensity to everything that was happening. Through the trees, James could see the first of the backup helicopters approaching the clearing, its crew apparently unaware of the electronic countermeasures being deployed below. The whining sound from the device near the van was growing stronger, and James could see interference patterns beginning to affect his own radio equipment. Whatever technology these people were using, it was sophisticated enough to pose a serious threat to the incoming rescue operation. Making a split-second decision that would later be described in classified reports as either incredibly brave or completely reckless, James began moving directly toward the van. If the electronic countermeasures succeeded in bringing down or disabling the helicopter, the two men would escape with their intelligence, and the royal family would remain vulnerable to whatever attack they were planning. His approach triggered an immediate response from the man with the rifle, who began firing shots in James's direction while shouting orders in a language that sounded like Russian or Ukrainian. The bullets struck the ground and trees around James's position, but his erratic movement and use of natural cover kept him from being hit as he continued advancing toward the van. The sound of the helicopter was now directly overhead, and James could see rappelling ropes dropping from the aircraft as the armed response team prepared to deploy. The electronic countermeasures device was clearly affecting the helicopter's systems, causing it to hover unsteadily as the pilot fought to maintain control. In the chaos of gunfire and rotor noise, James noticed something that changed everything about how he understood this operation. The shorter man near the van was not packing surveillance equipment. He was assembling what appeared to be a small explosive device, complete with timer and remote detonation capability. This wasn't just intelligence gathering. It was preparation for an active attack on the royal family. The realization that he might have prevented not just espionage, but an actual assassination attempt filled James with a surge of determination that carried him through the final yards toward the van. The man with the rifle was still firing in his direction, but the shots were becoming less accurate as the gunman was forced to divide his attention between James's approach and the soldiers descending from the helicopter above. What happened next would be reconstructed later from witness statements, radio recordings, and forensic evidence. But in the moment, James Mitchell experienced it as a blur of motion, sound, and adrenaline-fueled decision-making that would define the rest of his career in royal security. The brave guard who had started his shift by noticing something unusual in the bushes was about to become the man who prevented one of the most serious threats to the British royal family in modern history. The explosion of automatic gunfire and the thunderous roar of helicopter rotors had transformed the peaceful Scottish hillside into a war zone. But James Mitchell's focus had narrowed to a single, terrifying detail: the timer on the explosive device that the shorter man was frantically trying to complete. The red digital display showed 4:23 and was counting down rapidly, and James realized that whatever this device was intended for, it was going to detonate in less than 4.5 minutes. The armed response team from the helicopter had established a perimeter around the clearing, but their rules of engagement prevented them from taking decisive action while a civilian, James himself, was in the line of fire. Through his earpiece, he could hear urgent commands being shouted in multiple voices as the operation commanders tried to coordinate a response to a situation that was evolving faster than anyone could process. "All units, civilian is in the hot zone," came the voice of the helicopter team leader. "Cannot engage with current civilian position. Need immediate extraction or civilian withdrawal." But James knew there wasn't time for extraction or tactical repositioning. The timer on the explosive device continued its relentless countdown. 3:47, 3:46, 3:45, and every second of delay brought them closer to a disaster that could claim multiple lives and potentially change the course of British history. The royal family was scheduled to arrive at Balmoral in less than an hour, and if this device was designed to be remotely activated during their visit, the consequences would be catastrophic. The man with the rifle had taken cover behind the van and was maintaining steady fire in James's direction, but his shots were becoming less accurate as the stress of the situation affected his aim. James could hear the distinctive crack of bullets passing close to his head, but his military training had taught him that the human tendency was to aim high under pressure, and he used this knowledge to plan his final approach to the vehicle. Through gaps in the covering fire, James caught glimpses of the shorter man working frantically on the explosive device. The sophistication of the equipment was immediately apparent. This wasn't some crude homemade bomb, but a precisely engineered weapon designed for maximum destructive effect. The components were arranged with military precision, and the timer mechanism appeared to be hardened against electronic interference, which explained why the countermeasures being deployed by the helicopter team weren't affecting its operation. Control. The device appears to be a precision explosive with timer mechanism currently showing less than 3 minutes to detonation. James reported breathlessly into his radio while scrambling between cover positions. Suspect. This is intended for remote activation during royal visit. Immediate bomb disposal required. The response came back immediately from Chief Inspector Williams, and James could hear the strain in her voice as she tried to coordinate multiple crisis responses simultaneously. "Mitchell, bomb disposal is 15 minutes out. You need to either stop that timer or get clear of the blast radius immediately." The mathematics of survival were brutal and simple. James was too close to the device to survive its detonation. The helicopter team couldn't approach while he remained in the line of fire, and the bomb disposal experts were too far away to be of any help. The only option was for him to somehow neutralize the threat himself. Despite having no specialized training in explosive devices and facing armed opposition from professionally trained adversaries. As these calculations raced through his mind, James noticed something that changed his understanding of the entire situation. The man working on the explosive device wasn't just setting a timer. He was installing what appeared to be a remote detonation system, complete with radio receiver and backup power supply. The implications were immediately clear. This device wasn't intended to explode in the next few minutes, but rather to remain hidden and armed until the royal family arrived for their visit. The countdown timer wasn't showing time until detonation. It was showing time until the device would be fully armed and ready for remote activation. Once that timer reached 0, the explosive would become a hidden threat that could be triggered at any moment, potentially when the Queen and her family were walking the very grounds that James patrolled every morning. This realization filled James with a new sense of urgency and purpose. He wasn't just trying to save his own life or prevent an immediate explosion. He was potentially preventing the assassination of the British monarch and several members of the royal family. The weight of this responsibility transformed his tactical calculations and gave him the courage to take risks that would have seemed suicidal under normal circumstances. The timer now showed 2:31, and James could see that the shorter man was nearly finished with his work on the device. Once the arming sequence was complete, the explosive would become virtually undetectable to normal security sweeps and could remain dormant for days or weeks until remotely activated. The sophistication of this plan was both impressive and terrifying. These weren't amateur terrorists, but professionals with significant resources and technical capabilities. James made the decision that would define the rest of his life and career. Instead of waiting for backup or trying to maintain his defensive position, he broke from cover and began a direct assault on the van, moving in a zigzag pattern designed to make him a difficult target while closing the distance as quickly as possible. The man with the rifle immediately shifted his attention to this new threat, but the angle of James's approach forced him to expose himself to return fire from the helicopter team. The sound of gunfire erupted from multiple directions as the soldiers above finally had clear shots at one of the hostile targets. In the chaos of the firefight, James reached the van and dove behind the engine compartment, using the heavy machinery as cover while he tried to assess the situation with the explosive device. The shorter man had abandoned his work and was reaching for a sidearm, but his movements were panicked and uncoordinated as the tactical situation collapsed around him. The timer showed 1:47 and was still counting down relentlessly. James could see that the device was nearly complete. Just a few more connections needed to be made before it would be fully armed and operational. The components included what appeared to be several pounds of high-grade plastic explosive, enough to level a small building or create devastating casualties in a crowded area. Without specialized training or proper tools, James knew that attempting to disarm the device could easily trigger an immediate detonation. But allowing it to complete its arming sequence would create an ongoing threat that could be activated at any time, potentially when the royal family was most vulnerable. The choice was between certain immediate risk and potential future catastrophe. James grabbed the shorter man, who was still fumbling with his weapon, and pulled him away from the explosive device. "How do you stop it?" he shouted over the continuing gunfire. "How do you disable the timer?" The man's response was a stream of what sounded like Russian profanity, but his eyes kept darting toward a small keypad on the side of the device. James realized that there might be an abort code or shutdown sequence that could stop the arming process, but getting that information from an uncooperative hostile under combat conditions seemed almost impossible. The timer showed 1:12, and James could see additional connections being made automatically as the device continued its programmed arming sequence. Whatever decision he was going to make, it had to happen immediately. The sound of the helicopter above had changed pitch, and he could see more ropes dropping as additional specialized personnel arrived on scene. Through his earpiece, he heard Chief Inspector Williams's voice, strained but clear, Mitchell, bomb disposal reports they can talk you through emergency disarmament procedures, but success probability is less than 50%. Your call on how to proceed. With just over a minute left on the timer and armed hostiles still active in the area, James Mitchell faced the kind of decision that most people never have to make. Risk everything to protect others or preserve his own life and accept the potential consequences. The answer, for someone who had dedicated his career to protecting the royal family, was never really in doubt. What happened in the next 73 seconds would be studied by security professionals for years to come and would establish new protocols for dealing with technological threats to high-value targets. But in the moment, it was simply a brave man doing his job under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. With the timer showing 0:47 and counting down, James Mitchell found himself in a position that no amount of training could have truly prepared him for. The voice of the bomb disposal expert was crackling through his earpiece, providing step-by-step instructions that seemed impossibly complex given the chaos surrounding him and the rapidly diminishing time available. Mitchell, you need to locate the primary power source. It should be a battery pack connected to the main circuit board by red and black wires, came the calm, professional voice of Sergeant Major Patricia Ross, the Royal Army's senior explosive ordnance disposal specialist. Do not touch any other components until we identify the power source. The continuing gunfire and rotor noise made it difficult to hear the instructions clearly, but James could see the battery pack that the Sergeant Major was describing. It was a sophisticated lithium power cell, military grade, and designed to provide reliable power for extended periods. The red and black wires were exactly where she had said they would be, but they were surrounded by a maze of other connections that looked equally important. I see the power source, James reported, trying to keep his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. Multiple wire connections, some kind of backup power system visible as well. The timer showed 0:31, and James could see that some of the device's indicator lights had changed from red to amber, suggesting that the arming sequence was progressing exactly as programmed. In the background, he could hear the captured hostile muttering what sounded like prayers in his native language, apparently convinced that they were all about to die in the explosion. Listen carefully, Mitchell, came the voice of Sergeant Major Ross. There should be a small switch or button near the power supply, probably marked with Cyrillic characters. This is likely a manual abort mechanism required by whoever built this device. Can you see anything matching that description? James scanned the device frantically, looking for any switch or button that might serve as an emergency shutdown. The sophistication of the construction was impressive and terrifying. Every component was precisely placed and professionally installed, suggesting that this weapon had been built by someone with extensive experience in explosive devices and military hardware. There, partially hidden beneath a protective cover, James spotted a small red button with what appeared to be Russian lettering. The button was positioned in such a way that it would be easily accessible to whoever was installing or maintaining the device, but virtually impossible for someone to accidentally trigger. I found it, James reported. Small red button with foreign markings, positioned near the main power supply. Instructions? The timer was now showing 0:18, and James could feel sweat dripping down his face despite the cool Scottish morning air. The sound of gunfire had decreased as the helicopter team gained tactical superiority over the remaining hostile, but the mechanical countdown of the explosive device continued its relentless progression toward 0. That's almost certainly a manual abort switch, came the response from Sergeant Major Ross. Press and hold for 3 seconds, then release. If the device is going to shut down, the timer should stop and the indicator lights should change to green. James positioned his finger over the small red button, aware that this simple action could either save multiple lives or trigger the immediate detonation of several pounds of high-grade explosive. His military training had taught him that leadership meant making decisions under pressure, but nothing had prepared him for the possibility that one wrong move could result in his own death and the failure of a critical security operation. The timer showed 0:11 as James pressed the button and began counting slowly to 3. The device continued its countdown, 010, 009, 008, and for a terrifying moment, he thought that the abort mechanism had failed or that he had somehow misunderstood the instructions. Then, with the timer showing 005, everything changed. The countdown stopped, the amber indicator lights shifted to green, and the high-pitched whining sound that had been coming from the device's electronic components gradually faded to silence. The explosive device that had threatened to claim multiple lives and potentially alter the course of British history had been successfully neutralized. "Device is safe," James reported into his radio, and he could hear the collective sigh of relief from the multiple personnel monitoring the situation. "Timer has stopped, all indicator lights showing green, no apparent secondary activation systems." The response was immediate and filled with genuine emotion. "Outstanding work, Mitchell," came the voice of Chief Inspector Williams. "Bomb disposal team will be on site in 5 minutes for final verification and removal. You potentially saved multiple lives today." As the adrenaline began to fade, James became aware of his surroundings in a way that hadn't been possible during the intense focus of the past few minutes. The gunfire had stopped completely, and he could see that both hostiles had been taken into custody by the helicopter team. The sophisticated surveillance van was surrounded by security personnel who were carefully documenting every piece of equipment for later analysis. Through his earpiece, James could hear the coordination taking place as the security operation shifted from crisis response to intelligence gathering. The two captured individuals were being prepared for transport to a secure facility where they would be interrogated about their mission, their employers, and any other potential threats to royal security. The explosive device, now safely disarmed, would be carefully dismantled by specialists who would analyze every component to determine its origin, capabilities, and intended target. The surveillance equipment from the van would be examined to determine exactly what intelligence had been gathered and whether other royal residences had been compromised. But perhaps most importantly, the entire incident would trigger a comprehensive review of royal security protocols, with particular attention to the emerging threat posed by small drones and other technological surveillance methods. The world of royal protection had been fundamentally changed by what had happened in these Scottish hills, and James Mitchell had been at the center of that transformation. As the specialized personnel arrived to take control of the scene, James found himself reflecting on how a routine morning patrol had escalated into a life-or-death confrontation with international espionage agents. The skills he had learned during his military service had proven valuable, but it was his attention to detail and willingness to investigate unusual sounds that had ultimately prevented what could have been a catastrophic attack. 6 months later, James would receive a commendation from the Queen herself, recognizing his courage and quick thinking in protecting the royal family from a sophisticated assassination plot. The ceremony would take place at Balmoral Castle, in the same gardens where he had first heard the suspicious buzzing sound that had started everything. The official report on the incident, classified at the highest levels of government, would reveal that the two captured operatives were part of an international criminal organization that specialized in gathering intelligence for foreign governments and terrorist groups. The surveillance operation at Balmoral had been part of a larger plan to assassinate multiple members of the royal family during their private retreat, using the detailed intelligence gathered by the drone to plan the perfect attack. The explosive device that James had disarmed was just one component of a larger plot that included additional weapons cached around the estate and a coordinated assault plan for the day of the royal family's arrival. By detecting and disrupting the surveillance operation, James had not only prevented the immediate threat, but had also exposed and neutralized an entire network of hostile operatives. The investigation would eventually lead to arrests in 6 different countries and the disruption of multiple planned attacks against government officials and royal family members throughout Europe. The intelligence gathered from the captured equipment and personnel would provide security services with valuable insights into the methods and capabilities of modern technological threats. For James Mitchell, however, the most important outcome was much simpler. The royal family had arrived safely at Balmoral that afternoon and had enjoyed their annual retreat without ever knowing how close they had come to disaster. The quiet Scottish hillsides had returned to their peaceful state, and the only evidence of the morning's drama was the slightly increased security presence and the knowledge that one dedicated guard had made all the difference. The story of bushes, drones, and a brave guard would become part of the secret history of royal protection, a reminder that threats could come from unexpected directions and that the dedication of individual security personnel remained the most important defense against those who would harm the institutions of British democracy. In a world of high-tech surveillance and sophisticated weapons, sometimes the most important factor was still a guard who noticed something that didn't belong and had the courage to investigate.